The Shroud of Turin is one of the most well-known and most hotly contested of all Christian relics. The idea of a physical artifact which directly attests to the miraculous resurrection of Jesus poses a serious problem for anyone who believes Jesus was just some good teacher or perhaps didn't even exist at all. For that reason, many people find just enough evidence to support their desire for the shroud to be a medieval artistic forgery and consider the case closed. In fact, most people aren't even in a proper intellectual position to evaluate the evidence for the shroud, because for someone who has already presupposed that God doesn't exist and that Jesus was not raised from the dead, the only available option for the shroud is forgery. But if you're ready to approach the question objectively, remaining open to its authenticity and all of the worldview implications that accompany it, then join me as we dig into the evidence for the authenticity of the Shroud of Turin. For those not fully informed, let's first quickly review the basics on the Shroud of Turin. It's a piece of fabric made from linen threads. If you're not aware, linen comes from fibers of the flax plant. The threads are sewn in a 3-to-1 herringbone weave. The shroud is approximately 14.5 feet long by 3.5 feet wide. On the cloth are what appear to be bloodstains and a faint image of both the ventral and the dorsal sides of a man. You can imagine a man lying down on one side of a cloth with his feet toward the short edge, and then folding the cloth over his head to cover the front of his body. When the shroud was first photographed, the photographer developing his negatives discovered that the image of the man is essentially a photographic negative itself. This means that if you invert the colors of the photograph, the image becomes a photographic positive and significantly more discernible. The image itself contains three-dimensional information in the form of a shaded depth map. The image is darker in areas of protruding features like the nose and the chin, and lighter in areas of sunken features like the eye sockets and the sides of the head. Loading this information into modeling software results in a clear, three-dimensional image of the man. The Shroud of Turin gets its name because of its current home in Turin, Italy, where it's resided since 1578. It was first given to the House of Savoy, who resided in Turin, in 1453 by Margaret de Charnay. The first widely accepted owner of the shroud was Geoffrey de Charnay, and the shroud was known to be in his possession around 1350. There is no documented account of how Geoffrey came into possession of the shroud, though a plaque in a church on his land in Liry, France, says he received it as a gift from the King of France for his valor in battle. However, most people do not believe this story to be true because the shroud was never documented in possession of the French crown, and such a prized gift from a king to a nobleman would be highly unlikely. Since the time of its public presence in the 14th century, many have claimed to know the person who, quote, forged it, or heard that it was a forgery, though the accounts vary in name and age by hundreds of years, so no one has ever stepped forward to claim the masterpiece for themselves. In 1988, 3 samples were taken from the edge of the shroud adjacent to the left foot near the ventral image for carbon-14 radiometric dating by 3 independent labs. The collective date range they returned was 1260 to 1390 AD. On account of lack of documented history prior to the 14th century, combined with a carbon-14 date placing it solidly in the 14th century, most people believe the shroud to be a clever medieval forgery, and therefore consider the case to be closed. For most of my life, I too believed the shroud to be a medieval forgery, but I'm not really one to accept the claims of others simply on blind faith, so I decided to dig into that belief for myself. I realized I had absolutely no idea what the scientific evidence actually says, or what the Shroud of Turin research project actually discovered in their time with the shroud. I realized I had no idea what medium would have been used by the medieval artist, or whether or not we could even recreate it today. For those of you like me, what follows is the evidence that changed my mind and convinced me that the Shroud of Turin is indeed the authentic burial cloth of Jesus, and not at all compatible with the medieval forgery hypothesis. I hope you'll join me on my journey. Before we dig into the evidence, I need to offer some clarity on the fabrics in the Passion narrative. I've come to realize that many Christians read John's account of the burial preparation and assume that Jesus must have been wrapped up like a mummy. And since that assumption does not align with the idea of a burial shroud, these Christians automatically assume that the shroud is fake because it, quote, disagrees with the Word of God. So to better understand how the shroud fits into the gospel narratives, we need to take a closer look at the relevant verses. So let's start with the Synoptic Gospels. In Matthew 27, he indicates that Jesus is wrapped in a linen shroud. The Greek word here is syndon, which by definition is a fine linen cloth, or particularly a shroud. In Mark 15, he also indicates that Jesus is wrapped in a shroud, again using the same Greek word, syndon. And in Luke 23, he follows suit with the wrapping in a shroud, also using the same Greek word, syndon. So all three Synoptic Gospels are consistent in their indication that Jesus was buried and wrapped in a syndon, or a shroud. So then let's take a closer look at John's passage. When John says Jesus was wound in linen clothes, the Greek word that he's using is othonion, which in the plural refers to strips of linen. Now clearly, if these are intended to describe the same piece of fabric as the syndon in the Synoptic Gospels, then we have some sort of contradiction. But before we can draw that conclusion, we need to better understand what is being done with the fabric in each account, so as to shed light on exactly what is being described. Again, let's start with the Synoptics. All three verses translate the action to the English word wrapped, and both Matthew and Luke use the same Greek verb, entilisso, which means to roll in or to wrap in. This verb appears only one other time in the New Testament, in John chapter 20, when he describes the face cloth, or some translations call this the napkin, being folded up in a place by itself. So we can think of this verb as folding something up inside a piece of fabric, like folding a napkin over a dinner fork. The verb used in Mark is enileo, and while it's unique to the New Testament, it has almost the exact same meaning. We can think of this application as rolling something up inside of a rug. Now let's look at John. The Greek word for wound here in John chapter 19 is deo, which means to bind, tie, or to fasten. There are many instances of this verb in the New Testament, so we can get a very clear picture of what it's intended to convey. In Matthew chapter 12, Jesus describes having to bind up a strong man if you wanted to plunder his house. In Matthew chapter 13, Jesus describes the picking of weeds and bundling them to be burned. In Matthew 27, Jesus is bound as he is carried away as a prisoner. And even in John chapter 11, we see Lazarus' hands and feet bound as he comes out of the grave. So in the Synoptics, we see an entirely different description than that told by John. The Synoptics tell of Jesus being folded up or wrapped up in a shroud, while John tells of Jesus being bound or tied with linen strips. So it's clear that these are not at all describing the same events, which means that these are not describing the same fabrics. The Synoptics are describing Jesus being wrapped up in a shroud, folded up like a fork inside of a dinner napkin, and John is describing Jesus being bound up with strips of linen. This would have been a quick and effective way of combating rigor mortis and keeping the shroud in place for a quick burial until they could return to the tomb after the Sabbath had ended. So let's do a quick summary of the Passion fabrics. First, we have the shroud. This is the Greek word syndon, and it's used consistently across all three Synoptic Gospels. Next, we have the linen strips. This is the Greek word othonion, and appears in John's account of not only the burial, but also the resurrection, where we find them laying on the floor of the tomb. And here in John chapter 20, we also see the only reference to the third fabric in the Passion, the face cloth. This face cloth is the Greek word sudarion, which is kind of a handkerchief or a napkin or a small towel. The only other occurrence of this word comes to us from John chapter 11 in the account of Lazarus, where his face is wrapped up in a sudarion. This confirms for us that, as it pertains to burial, a sudarion was used to wrap around the face of the deceased. So in the Passion narrative, we find clear references to three different pieces of fabric. We don't really know what happened to the linen strips after they were discovered on the floor of the tomb. But as we will see, we have very good reason to believe that the Sindon is the Shroud of Turin, and that the Siderion is the Siderium of Oviedo. So a proper exegetical study of the text is actually perfectly consistent with the Shroud of Turin, and in fact is not consistent with the mummy concept, as some might believe. Now, before digging into the actual evidence, we should first demonstrate that the shroud is consistent with all of the necessary criteria in the biblical account of Jesus' crucifixion. We'll start with the clothing. According to all 4 gospel accounts, Jesus was stripped, and the soldiers dispersed his clothes among themselves. We can therefore conclude that Jesus was naked during his crucifixion. Looking at the image on the shroud, we see no shirt, pants, tunic, or loincloth. And the backside from glutes all the way down to the calves are clearly visible and defined. Therefore, the shroud is consistent with this detail. 3 of the 4 Gospels attest to Jesus being flogged or scourged by Pontius Pilate. The Roman tool for this kind of punishment was the flagrum, a 3-stranded whip with lead balls in the shape of dumbbells. If we look at the back of the man in the shroud, we see cuts all the way down the back, angled in 2 different directions as if coming from 2 different points of origin, and we can clearly see the dumbbell shape in many of the cuts. The cuts continue down the backside, where we can clearly see the dumbbell-shaped cuts in the glutes, all the way down the legs to the calves. Therefore, the shroud is consistent with this detail as well. 3 of the 4 Gospels attest to Jesus having a crown made of thorns being placed on his head. Since the shroud image contains both the front and back sides of a man, we can observe that there are in fact blood flows originating from wounds all around the crown of the scalp. Therefore, the shroud is consistent with this detail. 3 of the 4 Gospels tell of how Jesus was struck, slapped, and beat in the face multiple times. Such a beating should have left its mark on the face. And in fact, we do see signs of such trauma. For example, one cheek is elevated, one eyebrow is elevated, and the nose and one nostril are enlarged and swollen. Therefore, the shroud is consistent with this detail. John confirms for us that Jesus' legs were not broken. The cause of death in the practice of Roman crucifixion was actually asphyxiation. By breaking the legs, the victim could no longer lift himself up to allow the diaphragm to expand and contract, and he would stop breathing and suffocate to death. However, John tells us that Jesus died quickly enough that they didn't break his legs, and the image of the man in the shroud is consistent with this detail. From Luke and John, we discover that Jesus was crucified with nails, definitely in his hands, and for assumed consistency, also in the feet. We also learn that Jesus was pierced in the side after death by a Roman spear. The shroud shows clear puncture wounds at the wrist and corresponding blood flows all the way down the forearms. Additionally, there's a clear puncture wound in the center of one of the feet. Finally, upon inspection of the torso, there's a large blood flow coming from the side of the torso. Therefore, the shroud is consistent with all of the piercing details. So let's summarize the contents of the shroud. The man in the shroud has no clothing. The man in the shroud was flogged and scourged consistently with 1st century Roman practices. The man in the shroud has wounds on the crown of his head consistent with a crown of thorns. The man on the shroud shows signs of physical trauma to the face. The man on the shroud did not have his legs broken. And the man on the shroud shows signs of puncture wounds consistent with nails in the wrists and feet and a large puncture mid-torso. So clearly the contents of the shroud appear to meet all of the necessary criteria of the Bible. But does it pass the test of a professional forensic pathologist? According to Robert Buckland, world-renowned forensic pathologist and medical examiner, and the former deputy coroner of Los Angeles and Las Vegas, the left leg was rotated so that the left foot was placed on top of the right foot, a position maintained by the effects of rigor mortis. And based on the flexion of the left leg and the position of the left foot, he ascertained that the source of the puncture wound in the right foot would have penetrated both feet simultaneously. Furthermore, to account for the direction of blood flow, the forearms would have been outstretched at an angle of 65 degrees with the horizontal during the time of death. Buckland makes an interesting observation in the lack of thumbs in the image, and attributes it to muscle flexion due to nerve damage from the projectile which penetrated at the wrists. Moving to the torso puncture wound, he observes the presence of an additional water-like fluid among the blood stain, and also highlights the lack of splatter on the skin, concluding that this was a post-mortem puncture of a major arterial or organ source. And finally, he notes the abrasion and the softening of the skin and blood stains around the shoulders, consistent with the shouldering of a heavy object after the scourging. So not only is the image superficially in alignment with the biblical account, the expert witness of a professional forensic pathologist illuminates that the man in the shroud had developed rigor mortis prior to wrapping, that the forearm blood flow was consistent with outstretched arms, that the thumbs were flexed due to nerve damage from puncture at the wrist, that the mid-torso blood flow was post-mortem and originated from a major artery or organ, and that the man carried a heavy load on his shoulders after the initial scourging. All of these details only further expand on the correlation between the content of the shroud and the biblical passion narrative. One final point of interest. In every single medieval painting of Jesus' crucifixion, the nails are always in the center of the palm. Yet we know now, based on the physical structure of the bones in the hand, that a nail in that location would simply rip out through the fingers. It would not sufficiently carry the weight of the crucifixion victim. Interestingly, the shroud is different from every piece of medieval artwork in this detail, in that it places the nails at the wrist. Not only is this different, but it's also physiologically possible. That means that the shroud is more medically and physiologically accurate than every piece of medieval crucifixion artwork. So is the content of the shroud consistent with the biblical passion narrative? Absolutely. Alright, let's begin our investigation by looking at how the image was formed on the shroud. The image is not created by any paint, stain, or dye. It's not due to oil or bodily composition. It's not caused by acid, powder, or heat. Interestingly, there's no material, whether organic or inorganic, deposited on the shroud to form the image. The image does not crack at the fold lines, and there's no difference in spatial distribution when viewing the image in the infrared spectrum when compared with the visible spectrum, a feature present in brushed paintings. Also, if we look closely at the threads of the shroud themselves, we observe an interesting phenomenon. Each thread consists of many microscopic fibrils, and in the blood-stained areas of the shroud, the blood wicks through all of the fibrils by capillary action, meaning we can see the bloodstains on the back of the shroud. However, the image is present only on the topmost fibrils, indicating a lack of capillary action. And this is interesting because it is not physically possible to apply any sort of liquid, paint, stain, or dye to the shroud without it wicking through to the backside through capillary action. So we know for certain that the image could not have been formed through any sort of liquid applied to the surface. One final interesting observation: darker areas in the image are not formed by fibrils darkened to a greater extent. Rather, darker areas appear darker because of an increased density of darkened fibrils, and all of the darkened fibrils on the shroud are darkened to the same extent. This means that the fibril darkening cannot be attributed to an extended exposure process like heat or sun bleaching. Such a process would cause fibrils to darken proportionally to the time over which the process was applied, which means lighter areas of the image would contain lighter fibrils, and darker areas of the image would contain darker fibrils, which is not consistent with the data observed in the shroud. So then, what does cause the image to appear on the surface of the shroud? The fibrils are darkened because the cellulose molecules in the flax fibrils have been chemically altered. There are carbon atoms in the cellulose molecule which, under normal circumstances, share a single electron bond, but the darkened fibrils contain cellulose molecules in which the carbon atoms have a double electron bond. The question is, what can produce the net effect of the image of the shroud? We've experimentally determined that heat can induce the molecular change in the flax fibrils. However, heat cannot create shaded regions with an equal extent of fibril change, and it cannot create a 3D depth map unless we change some fibrils more than others. There's a theory out there called the shadow shroud, which posits an inverted painting on glass that the sun could bleach areas of the shroud lighter than others, effectively creating the 3D depth map of light and dark. But while sun bleaching could induce a molecular change in the fibrils, it wouldn't be the same since the darkened fibrils would be unchanged while the lighter ones would be chemically modified. Also, it could not induce the same extent of molecular change as those areas bleached lighter would have fibrils modified to a greater extent than those that are less bleached. In fact, so far, the only one process which has been able to produce all of the chemical effects of the fibrils and result in a 3D depth map of a man on the linen is radiation. But if radiation is in fact the best explanation for how the image was formed, that raises some big questions for both major hypotheses. We have absolutely no idea how a medieval artist could have used a controlled radiation source to create the image in the shroud. In fact, do we even possess this ability today? No, we don't. The previously cited result comes from simulation only, because even with our advanced technology today, we cannot reproduce the image with all of the same chemical effects we observe in the shroud. But for those who claim authenticity, why would we believe that a human body could emit radiation? Do we have any scientific evidence of a body emitting radiation? Surprisingly, we do. In 2018, we captured for the first time the radiation of zinc molecules from a human egg through the natural processes at the moment of fertilization. This result doesn't necessarily mean that we can say for certain that Jesus' body emitted some sort of particle radiation while wrapped in the shroud, but it certainly makes it physically and scientifically possible. So based on all of the scientific evidence gathered from the shroud, we can with a high level of confidence assert that radiation was the mechanism that formed the image. Next, we'll look at the blood-stained regions on the shroud to see exactly what they're made of. The bloodstains contain heme derivatives, bilirubin, albumin, serum albumin, iron, and protein content. They contain both X and Y chromosomes and hemoglobin DNA. Recent research has also located the presence of creatinine in the blood regions. So then what can we conclude? The bloodstains are caused by actual blood. Some skeptics have tried to posit the use of a medieval paint derived from iron and vermilion, which might be able to explain some of the chemical results. However, such a paint would not have serum albumin, X and Y chromosomes, nor hemoglobin DNA, which is an informational molecule. Additionally, since iron is a heavy metal, it would appear differently under X-ray than areas outside of the bloodstains. But that's not the case. Bloodstain regions are indistinguishable from non-bloodstain regions under X-ray analysis. So we can confidently conclude that this medieval paint does not explain all the evidence. Others have accepted the presence of blood and simply posit a theory that the artist painted with blood. The first problem with this theory is that there are no brush strokes on the shroud anywhere. Also, serum albumin is involved in clotting of blood. So the blood on the shroud was either clotting or already clotted, which means it won't flow very easily. We also know that bilirubin is formed when old or damaged red blood cells are broken down, which means that the source of the blood had excessive damage to its red blood cells, as would be the case in severe wounds. And creatinine is also found in the blood of trauma victims, meaning the source of the blood had undergone severe physical trauma. But the most damaging piece of evidence to this hypothesis is that the cross-contamination antigen response of the blood does not match any known species of animal in existence. That means that the artist couldn't have simply used a common animal like a dog or a pig as the source of the blood. However, the closest antigen profile is that of human type AB blood, which means that the source of the blood was closer to human type AB blood than any other known species in existence. So then, if the bloodstains are made from genuine blood, what does that mean for our two main hypotheses? For the medieval forgery hypothesis to hold water, we must assume that an artist used the blood of a male organism from some unknown but almost human species with type AB blood, who had undergone intense trauma and suffered severe wounds. We must assume that the artist allowed the blood to begin clotting and then applied it to the shroud without the use of a brush. However, the authentic hypothesis is significantly less ad hoc, since the presence of blood from a trauma victim with many wounds is completely consistent with Jesus' crucifixion. And if Jesus were conceived miraculously, as is described in the Bible, it would completely explain why his DNA and associated blood would respond to cross-contamination in a way almost identically to, but not quite the same as a typical human. So then, based on all of the scientific evidence, what can we conclude about the bloodstain regions on the shroud? They're the result of clotting or clotted blood from a tortured, traumatized, almost human male organism. In addition to the molecular structure of the fibrils and the contents of the blood stains, there are numerous other pieces of physical evidence on or within the shroud which directly contradict the medieval origin hypothesis. For example, the spinning wheel had become a standard piece of equipment in Europe by the 13th century. However, the threads on the shroud were not produced on the spinning wheel. They are hand spun. In addition, the 3-to-1 herringbone weave was not being produced in medieval Europe and is much more common in ancient Syria. As mentioned earlier, the shroud's approximately 14.5 feet long by 3.5 feet wide. If we translate those dimensions into Roman cubits, the standard unit of measure in medieval Europe, the shroud is about 10.6 by 2.6 Roman cubits. But if we translate it into Assyrian cubits, the standard unit of measure in 1st century Judea, the shroud is almost exactly 8 by 2 Assyrian cubits. Though it's somewhat circumstantial, it seems unlikely that a piece of fabric would be sold at fractional standard market dimensions, especially since there's a side strip sewn onto the side of the shroud to make it the proper width. It seems much more likely that the fabric was sold in a market that used the Assyrian cubit for its standard unit of measure. Interestingly, the stitch used to sew the side strip onto the shroud is very unique historically. It has only been found in textiles from one other place in history, the ancient city of Masada, which was a Jewish city destroyed in 73 AD and never reoccupied. So from a historical analysis, the manufacturing method of the thread, the weave of the linen, the fabric dimensions, and the stitch of the side strip are all incompatible with the medieval origin, yet align perfectly with the 1st century Judean origin. At a microscopic level, we find cotton fibers among the linen threads, specifically a cotton species called Gossypium herbaceum. This particular species of cotton does not grow in Europe, but rather in the Middle East and Africa. In addition, there are limestone particles on the shroud, especially around the area of the feet. The spectral signature of these limestone particles is not consistent with that found in Europe, but perfectly matches the samples taken from Jerusalem. Pollen evidence is also of significant interest, as there are 58 species of pollen found on the shroud. However, only 17 of those 58 species actually grow in Europe. The remaining 41 species of pollen do not grow in Europe at all, but rather in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. In fact, of the 58 species of pollen on the shroud, 55 of them grow in Jerusalem. And only 3 species of pollen do not grow in either Europe or Jerusalem. Those 3 species of pollen are local to regions of Urfa, which used to be called Edessa, and Constantinople. In fact, of the 58 species of pollen on the shroud, 18 of them grow in Urfa or Edessa, and 13 of them grow in Constantinople. So with 58 species of pollen on the shroud, there are many species local to Jerusalem, Edessa, and Constantinople, in addition to the European species of pollen. If the fabric had originated in Europe and remained in France for the entirety of its existence, there's absolutely no way to explain the presence of so many species of non-European pollen. There's also a species of pollen of particular interest, called Gundelia. This pollen, which was found in very large amounts on the shroud, is a thistle local to the Middle East, which has very long thorns on it. So from microscopic analysis, the Middle Eastern cotton in the flax fibers, the Jerusalem limestone, the 41 species of non-European pollen are all incompatible with the medieval origin, yet align perfectly with a 1st century Judean origin. While carbon dating is the gold standard, there are certain physical properties of the shroud material that can assist in the discovery of the age of the fabric. As a review, the carbon dating puts the shroud between 1260 and 1390 AD. Yet there are 2 flax spectroscopy tests which are used to determine the age of flax fibers themselves. And these 2 tests say that the flax fibers are from anywhere between 700 BC and 300 AD. And an additional test of the tensile strength of flax fibers indicates that the fibers originated between 0 and 800 AD. Plus, a test of a material aging due to ambient environmental factors puts the flax fibers at about the same age as the Dead Sea Scrolls, which originated between 250 BC and 70 AD. So by employing additional methods of aging flax fibers, we can find that the 2 spectroscopy tests, the tensile strength test and the environmental damage test, are all incompatible with the medieval European origin, yet align perfectly with the 1st century Judean origin. So let's summarize the physical evidence. When we evaluate the manufacturing of the thread, the linen weave, the physical dimensions, the side strip stitch, the cotton fibers in the thread, the pollen species on the shroud, the limestone particles on the shroud, and the 4 additional means of aging flax fibers, we find that not a single piece of physical evidence is consistent with the medieval European origin. Yet, every single piece of evidence aligns perfectly with a 1st century Judean origin, which means that the physical evidence deposited on the shroud is completely incompatible with the medieval forgery hypothesis, and instead points exclusively to the authenticity of the shroud. As I discussed earlier, there were 3 pieces of fabric in the Passion story: the Sindon, the Othonion, and the Sudarian. The last one, if you recall from John chapter 20, was a napkin or a face cloth that was used to wrap the face of Jesus and was found in the tomb on that Resurrection Sunday. We have actually very good reason to believe that the Sudarium of Oviedo is that Sudarian. The Sudarium of Oviedo actually has a very well documented paper trail. It was in Judea until 614 AD when it was taken to Alexandria by a presbyter named Philip, ahead of the Persian conquest of Jerusalem. Then just 2 years later, as Persia continued south in their conquest, the Sudarium was taken across North Africa as Persia continued to expand its empire. The Sudarium fled to Spain among the refugees, entering at Cartagena. It spent the next 100 years in Seville and Toledo, and then in 718 AD it entered the region of Oviedo, and it's still housed in a church in Oviedo today. Since the Sudarium doesn't have an image on it, and there's no interruption of the image around the head and the shroud, it must be true that the Sudarium was not on the body at the time of Jesus' burial, which has led some to question why it would be in the tomb at all. So to quickly answer that, let's review the code of Jewish law, which declares that the final blood coming from the body at the moment of death is considered the, quote, lifeblood. And according to this code, anything which contains the lifeblood should be buried with the body, so as not to separate the body from the lifeblood. So according to the contemporary Jewish law, the Sudarium, which likely covered Jesus' head while he was being removed from the cross, evidence of which we'll discuss in a minute, would have wiped some of the blood from Jesus' body and would have therefore been considered a carrier of lifeblood. And that's precisely why we should expect the Sudarium to be in the tomb, even if separate from the body and the shroud. So let's dig into the evidence discovered under scientific investigation of the Sudarium. First, there's a significant amount of dirt and pollen on the Sudarium. Dirt samples and pollen species match those sampled from Judea, North Africa, and Spain, supporting the documented paper trail of the Sudarium. In fact, the dirt matches samples taken specifically from the area around Calvary, where Jesus was crucified. Interestingly, the Siderium contains a large amount of pollen from the Gundelia thistle, the same thorn-bearing Middle Eastern thistle found on the shroud. It also contains stains of both blood and fluid in a ratio of 1:6. Though a full species analysis has not been performed on the blood is or very closely matches human type AB blood, the same as found on the shroud. The fluid is pleural edema, a fluid that develops in the lungs of those who die of asphyxiation. When the body is jolted, this fluid can come out of the nostrils. Furthermore, the fluid stains show signs of drying between additional fluid discharges, meaning the body underwent multiple rounds of movement after the Siderium had wrapped the head. Based on this evidence, forensic analysis has concluded that the Siderium of Oviedo wrapped the head of a person who died of asphyxiation. Additional analysis of the stain patterns indicate that the person died in the upright position with his head tilted 70 degrees forward and 20 degrees toward the right shoulder. And the person's nose was 8 centimeters long, which happens to be identical to the shroud. And the blood points originated at the exact same locations as on the shroud. So, if we do a quick summary of the comparison between the Siderium and the shroud, we find that the blood type is identical, the facial geometry is nearly identical, and the blood origin points are identical. They both contain significant amounts of dirt and pollen from non-European locations, and we know that the evidence corresponds perfectly to the documented Siderium paper trail. They both contain significant amounts of pollen from the thorn-bearing Middle Eastern Gundelia thistle, and they both show forensic evidence of a death consistent with the Roman practice of crucifixion. In fact, the one and only data point that conflicts between the shroud and the Siderium is the carbon dating, which places the Siderium around 700 AD, some 600 years earlier than the shroud. So, based on the scientific and historical evidence, the Siderium of Oviedo is very tightly coupled to the Shroud of Turin on everything except the carbon dating. One interesting fact that many are willing to simply overlook is that 700 AD postdates the known history of the Siderium by nearly 100 years. By 700 AD, the Siderium was in Spain, yet the physical evidence deposited on the Siderium clearly indicates that it spent significant time in the Middle East. So then, what we've seen so far is that every bit of scientific evidence and historical evidence on both the Shroud of Turin and the Siderium of Oviedo points to the authenticity of both artifacts, all with the exception of the carbon dating. Additionally, carbon dating is the only piece of discrepancy between the two artifacts, which are otherwise very tightly coupled by the physical evidence. And the carbon dating of the Siderium postdates its known documented history, which is corroborated by pollen and dirt evidence by at least 100 years. So it's time to address the elephant in the room, the carbon dating. To understand what's ahead, you'll need to first understand how carbon dating works. So let's have a quick science lesson. Carbon, if you recall from high school chemistry, has an atomic number of 6, which means it has 6 protons in the nucleus. Under normal neutral charge conditions, carbon also has 6 electrons orbiting the nucleus, balancing out the charge of the protons. And in its most common state, carbon atoms contain 6 neutrons in the nucleus. Since there are 6 protons and 6 neutrons for a total of 12 subatomic particles in the nucleus, this form of carbon is known as carbon-12, and since it's charge neutral, it's also very stable. Now, if we were to add another proton to the nucleus, then we'd change the atomic number, which creates a new element, in this case nitrogen. But if we were to add another neutron to the nucleus, then we would form what's called an isotope of the current atom. One of the known carbon isotopes is carbon-14. 14 because it has 6 protons and 8 neutrons, for a total of 14 subatomic particles in the nucleus. And this particular isotope is not at all very stable. Over a certain amount of time, one of the neutrons will undergo beta decay, meaning it will change to a proton and kick out an electron. And since we now have 7 protons in the nucleus, and we have a new atomic number, and a new element, nitrogen. And this atom with 7 protons, 7 electrons, and 7 neutrons is very stable. So over time, these carbon-14 isotopes will decay into nitrogen-14 atoms, and that decay has a half-life of 5,730 years. If you don't recall, the term half-life basically means that half of a quantity of an element will be gone after the time has elapsed. So if you have a given quantity of carbon-14, half of it will be gone after 5,730 years. After another 5,730, half of the remainder will be gone. And again, and again. We can plot this exponential curve as a percentage remaining versus time. So if we take a sample and determine the percentage of carbon-14 lost, we can figure out the percent remaining. We find where that intersects the half-life curve and locate the x value of the intersection point to find the time elapsed. In this case, 1,984 years. But how do we find the percent of carbon-14 remaining in a sample? To answer that, we need to know how carbon-14 is formed. So here's the Sun and the Earth. When a cosmic ray enters our atmosphere, it interacts with particles there and creates a secondary cosmic ray in the form of an energized neutron. This neutron collides with the stable nitrogen-14 atoms in the atmosphere. The result of this reaction is the formation of a carbon-14 atom with 6 protons, 6 electrons, and 8 neutrons, and the ejection of a proton with no neutrons, or essentially a hydrogen atom. So we all know that carbon will react with oxygen and form carbon dioxide, and this carbon dioxide is absorbed by plant life during photosynthesis, resulting in the production of oxygen. And the carbon broken down from the CO2 is absorbed by the plant. Some of that carbon absorbed will be a stable carbon-12 isotope, and some of it will be other carbon isotopes, like carbon-14. Since carbon-14 production is based on natural processes in our atmosphere, the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12 atoms absorbed by the plant is, for all intents and purposes, constant. So the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12 is constant in the air, in the plants that absorb it from the air, in the animals that eat the plants, and in the animals that eat the animals that eat the plants. But when a plant dies or is harvested, it no longer absorbs new carbon. And when an animal dies, it no longer consumes sources of new carbon. And under normal conditions, the amount of carbon-12 in the object will remain constant, but the amount of carbon-14 atoms begins to decay with a half-life of 5,730 years. So if we take a sample of something, we can measure the number of carbon-12 atoms in it, represented by the variable m, and the number of carbon-14 atoms, represented by n. If we take our constant ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12 and multiply that by the number of carbon-12 atoms in the sample, that will give us the initial number of carbon-14 atoms in the sample, represented by the variable k. By dividing our current number of carbon-14 atoms by the initial number, we arrive at the percent of carbon-14 remaining, which we can plug into our half-life formula to determine the time elapsed since the death of the plant or animal in question. So armed with this knowledge, let's take a look at the dating of the Shroud. Recall the 3 independent labs measured samples from the Shroud, and they each arrived at a certain percentage of carbon-14 remaining, correlated that to an elapsed time of around 600 to 730 years. This meant that the flax plant, which was used for the linen thread, was harvested somewhere between 1260 and 1390 AD. Likewise, with the cerium, a sample was taken, percentage of carbon-14 determined, and time elapsed was determined to be about 1,290 years. This meant that the flax plant, which was used for the linen thread, was harvested around 700 AD. So for those who hold to the medieval forgery hypothesis, the carbon dating results simply confirmed their existing beliefs. Case closed. And for those who held to the authenticity in the past, they posited various theories to explain the mismatched dating results. Some have claimed that the samples were tainted by various burns on the Shroud or by exposure to church fires, which it had been stored in the past. Some have claimed that medieval fabric was sewn into the original Shroud in a way that was overlooked by those taking the measurements. And some have even claimed that what was actually sampled was a patch from a medieval repair. But all of these theories have failed for one reason or another, and none of them are taken seriously by most scholars today. However, within the last 10 years, a new hypothesis has come into play. and one that ties all of these uncertainties together. To understand this new hypothesis, let's revisit the carbon dating on the shroud. In each of the 3 samples, the lab would have calculated the M and the N variables, then determined the initial quantity of carbon-14 in the shroud. And by dividing N by K, they get the percent remaining and calculated the elapsed time. But what happens if our initial carbon-14 calculation is actually not correct? What if instead of just being K, we have K prime atoms, which would be the theoretical K value plus some additional carbon-14 represented by Q? In this case, since K is not representative of the true initial quantity of carbon-14 atoms, our percent remaining is incorrect. To get a true percent remaining, we would need to be dividing our current quantity N by the true initial quantity K prime. So our graph would actually look something like this, where the incorrect curve, which doesn't take into account our additional carbon-14 atoms, is the dashed line, and our correct curve is the solid line. So we could then look at the percent remaining discovered by the 3 independent labs and see that while the dates calculated do cross the incorrect curve, those dates are not the correct intersection with the true curve. Rather, the true intersection point has a significantly longer time elapsed. This means that if the initial carbon-14 is actually higher than the theoretical K value, then a sample would actually be significantly older than the uncorrected calculation predicts. But why would we even consider this? Why think there would be additional carbon-14 atoms in the shroud? For that, we need to go back to how carbon-14 is created in our atmosphere. Recall that cosmic rays create energized neutrons, which react with the nitrogen-14 atoms to create a carbon-14 and a hydrogen atom. And recall that the leading scientific explanation of the image formation mechanism in the shroud is radiation. Now, radiation can be in the form of a wave, but it can also be in the form of energized particles, like neutrons. So in a human body about the size of the man of the shroud, there are 2 times 10 to the 28th neutrons. And if just 2 times 10 to the 18 of those, which is only 1/10 billionth of the available neutrons, were radiated from the body, it would react with enough nitrogen-14 atoms and produce enough carbon-14 atoms to make a 1st century piece of linen fabric look like it originated in the 14th century. Enter the neutron absorption hypothesis. This theory is put forth by Robert Rucker, a retired nuclear engineer who spent his entire career designing and simulating nuclear reactors and the associated radiation inherent in their design. For this hypothesis, he simulated a body wrapped in a linen shroud, placed in a tomb consistent with 1st century Jewish practices. Based on the composition of the body, he simulated the distribution of neutrons that would have been absorbed by the linen, and used that to calculate the effective carbon-14 date that would result on the shroud. This table is a top-down view of the tomb table and the side benches. First point of interest is that the calculated carbon-14 date near the feet does in fact show the dates in the 12th to 14th century time frame. Next point of interest is that at the center of mass, the calculated age would be thousands of years in the future because there was so much carbon-14 generated. This means that if the Vatican would let us carbon date a sample from the torso region, we could effectively further validate this hypothesis. Let's just hope that happens in the near future. Another interesting result from this simulation is that near the feet, there's a correlation between calculated age of the fabric and linear distance from the edge of the shroud. So Rucker went back and looked at the actual carbon-14 data from the 3 labs, which was only recently published. He noticed that the Oxford lab returned a 1200 AD result, Zurich returned a 1273 AD result, and Tucson returned a 1303 AD result. If we compute the difference between these results, we end up with an uncertainty of 102 years plus or minus 35 years, which equates to nearly a 3 sigma uncertainty. First of all, this is well beyond the maximum 2 sigma threshold accepted in most carbon-14 tests. But more importantly, Rucker noticed that there is indeed a positive correlation between the calculated dates and the distance of the samples from the edge of the fabric, consistent with his simulated results. Rucker also went back to look at the data to see if he could explain the dating of the Sudarium of Oviedo. As it turns out, there are bands along either side bench where if the sudarium were placed, it would date to around 700 AD. So all in all, Rucker's hypothesis can explain why the shroud dates to the 13th or 14th century, why the shroud carbon-14 data has such a large statistical variance, why there is a correlation between the calculated age and distance from the edge of the shroud, and why the shroud and the sudarium, which are so closely coupled in all the scientific evidence, date to nearly 600 years apart. And perhaps the most interesting of all is that Rucker's hypothesis is completely consistent with the leading scientific explanation and only known cause of the molecular change to the cellulose molecules in the flax fibers that form the image of the shroud. The medieval forgery hypothesis, however, has absolutely no answer to any of the above questions, and still does not address the myriad of scientific evidence pointing to the authenticity of the Shroud of Turin and the Sudarium of Oviedo. So why is the carbon-14 result on the shroud and the sudarium wrong? The most likely explanation is that energized neutrons radiated from the body, the same ones which cause the image to form through the molecular change in the cellulose molecules of the shroud, and they produced additional carbon-14 atoms in the fabrics, making them look significantly younger than they really are. So far, we've uncovered numerous scientific evidences which point to the authenticity of the Shroud of Turin. And we've presented the neutron absorption hypothesis, which rectifies all of the outlying carbon-14 data with the remainder of the physical evidence. All this to say, the case for authenticity is very strong, but the question on the shroud's location remains unknown. So let's dig into the historical record and see if we can find the Shroud of Turin before Geoffroy de Charnay in 1350. The first task is to find historical mentions of the shroud, references in written accounts that speak of Jesus' burial cloth or sindone. And the first potential hit comes from Theodore of Epirus in 1205 AD. He wrote a letter to Pope Innocent III in which he protested the looting that had happened in Constantinople after the toppling of the city in 1204 AD with the Fourth Crusade. And he describes how the Venetian soldiers looted the treasure and the gold, and the French soldiers looted the holy relics. And the most sacred of all the relics he mentions, the linen in which our Lord Jesus Christ was wrapped after his death and before the resurrection. He also informs us that this sacred linen was now in Athens. He doesn't explicitly mention an image or anything, but he does say that it used to be in Constantinople, and that it was looted in 1204 and taken to Athens. So let's start by looking in Constantinople. In his work titled The History of Those Who Conquered Constantinople, Robert de Clary, a Crusader knight who was stationed in Constantinople from 1203 to 1204, tells us a little more about this mysterious linen in Constantinople prior to the looting. There in the church was the shroud in which our Lord had been wrapped, and on it, apparently, was the figure of our Lord. Now the old French word for shroud here is sandouin, which is equivalent to the Greek word sindon, and the word for figure here roughly translates to bodily form. So this crusader, present in Constantinople before its sacking, saw with his own eyes a sindon with the figure or bodily form of Jesus on it, and corroborates for us that it was looted when the city was taken. To further corroborate the account, Emperor Constantine VII, living in Constantinople, sent a letter in 958 AD to encourage his troops while on campaign. He told them he was sending them holy water that had been consecrated by holy relics, including the shroud, or sindon, which God wore. So we have good reason to believe, based on the historical evidence, that a shroud referred to as, quote, a shroud that God wore, complete with a figure of our Lord on it, existed in Constantinople from at least 958 AD to 1204 AD. We can't know for certain that this is the Shroud of Turin, so for now let's just call this the Shroud of Constantinople. The next logical question is, where did the Shroud of Constantinople come from? In the early 12th century, prior to 1130 AD, Vatican Library Codex 5696, folio 35, was written as an explanation for the history of the Shroud of Constantinople. It has an interesting retelling of an old legendary tale. The legend is that of King Abgar, king of Edessa, who requests a visit from Jesus in the 1st century. But Jesus, being preoccupied with his ministry, declined to visit and said he would send an apostle to visit him along with the portrait. But this is no ordinary portrait. In this 12th century account, Jesus says, "I'm sending you a likeness not only of my face, but of my whole body divinely transformed on a cloth." So according to this document, the Shroud of Constantinople is some sort of likeness of the entire body of Jesus on a cloth. Interesting in and of itself, but this document is of particular interest for two reasons. First, because the legend goes back to much earlier in history, but in earlier versions, like the one on a Good Friday sermon from Pope Stephen III in 769 AD, Jesus says, "I'm sending you a likeness of my face on a cloth." Notice no mention of whole body. Second, this is interesting because the Abgar legend applies to an even older and much more widely known image in history, the image of Edessa. And we know for certain that the image of Edessa arrived in Constantinople on August 15th, 944 AD. So why would the Vatican records take a previous legend pertaining to the image of Edessa and alter the sayings of Jesus to make it more indicative of an entire body image on a burial shroud? To answer that, we need to look more into the image of Edessa. The first truly historical reference we have to the image of Edessa comes in the year 544 AD. The Persian king Khosroes laid siege to the city of Edessa, but the city was able to repel the attack. In his account of the siege, historian Evagrius Scholasticus recounts how the town was saved through the miraculous assistance of the divinely made image not made by the hands of man. This phrase, "not made by the hands of man," is the Greek word akairopoietos, which literally means "not hands made," and is often used to describe the image of Edessa. Though the Abgar legend is likely not entirely historical, it can reveal to us some interesting insight on the nature of the image. For example, in 620 AD, the Acts of Thaddeus retells the old Abgar legend to explain the history of the image of Edessa. But in this version, Jesus washes his face and then wipes it on a towel so that his image was imprinted upon the linen and has it delivered to Abgar. A few interesting things here. First, the word towel here is unique. It's the Greek word tetradiplon, which literally means four doubles. Second, the word linen here is sindon, the same word for the shroud in the Gospels. And third, the image is described as the imprint of drying Jesus' wet face, not from any painter or sculptor. So according to the writings in the early 7th century, the image of Edessa was actually a sindon, or shroud, containing what looked like a water imprint of Jesus' face on it, and it had been doubled in 4. More on that in a minute. Now in 639 AD, Muslims conquered Edessa, but allowed the Christians to continue to pay the jizya and celebrate their Christian traditions, including the veneration of the image. In 943 AD, the Byzantine emperor started negotiations with Muslim rulers in Edessa in an effort to obtain the image of Edessa and add it to his collection of relics in Constantinople. He offered immunity from attack, 12,000 pieces of silver, and the release of 200 Muslim prisoners, all in exchange for the image of Edessa. The Muslim leaders accepted in 944, and on August 15th, 944 AD, the image of Edessa arrived in Constantinople, and the event is commemorated in the image titled The Surrender of the Mandylion. Interestingly, in his account of the event, Simenon Magister reported that the emperor's 2 sons, upon viewing the image, could see nothing but a faint face, but their brother-in-law and future Emperor Constantine VII, who was an artist himself, could, quote, discern various facial features. The next day, Gregory Referendarius, Archdeacon of Hagia Sophia, delivered a sermon celebrating the Holy Mandylion, in which he describes the image of Edessa as linen on which Jesus wiped his sweat and miraculously imprinted his form onto the linen. The following year, August 16th was designated as a holy feast day to celebrate the Holy Mandylion, or image of Edessa, a holiday that's still celebrated to this day. Also, Constantine VII delivered his festival sermon, where he described the image of Edessa as, quote, not made by hand, and having a likeness of our Lord, and being fastened to our board and embellished with gold. So let's quickly review what historical documentation can reveal to us about the image of Edessa. It was a sindone, or shroud. It was 4 doubles, or doubled in 4. It was mounted on a wooden frame, and it was embellished with gold. It was described as being not made by human hands, and it contained a barely discernible faint image of Jesus' face, as if Jesus had wiped water or maybe sweat from his face. The image was in Edessa from 544 AD, and it moved to Constantinople in 944 AD. And it has a holy feast day that's still celebrated today. Let's pause here and take a minute to discuss a few points of interest. First, recall that Emperor Constantine's letter to his troops in 958 AD, where he sent the holy water that had been consecrated by the holy relics, including the shroud that God wore. Notably missing from the list was the image of Edessa. We have a relic that has its own feast day, that was acquired through the release of 200 prisoners and 12,000 pieces of silver, that arrived in the city to fanfare, parades, and festivals, and yet it wasn't even used to consecrate the holy water. Second, the evolution of the Abgar legend over time. In 620 AD, Jesus dried a wet face on linen. In 769 AD, it contained the likeness of Jesus' face. In 944 AD, Jesus wiped his sweat on the linen. And then in 1130 AD, the image suddenly contains not just Jesus' face, but his entire body as well. It's interesting that the Byzantines would take the same legendary origin of the image of Edessa and apply it to the shroud that God wore as well. Third, the importance of the image of Edessa cannot be overstated. It still has its own feast day, celebrated today. And yet, when the city was looted, no one ever complained about it going missing, and no one ever pleaded to get it back. For something so important to the Byzantines and the history of its feast day, it's hard to explain why every mention of it suddenly went missing without any complaint or question. Finally, we have this image of Edessa, some sort of shroud with the miraculous imprint of Jesus' face on it, complete with its own fanfare, parades, sermons, holidays, etc. Somewhat expected. But if the image of Edessa has such fanfare accompanying it, how much more so with the shroud worn by God, complete with the entire imprint of Jesus' body? Yet there's absolutely nothing in the historical record. The shroud that God wore simply appears without cause or celebration at about the same time that the image of Edessa falls completely off the radar. So what can we make of all of this? What's the best explanation of all this historical data? Quite simply, the image of Edessa is the Shroud of Constantinople. It first shows up in Edessa around 544 AD as a shroud, doubled in 4, mounted to a wooden frame and embellished with gold, and it contains a faint image of the face of Jesus. It arrives in Constantinople around 944 AD, pretty much unchanged. Yet sometime between 944 and 958 AD, someone looked under the embellishments and discovered that this shroud, when unfolded, contained more than just the faint image of Jesus' face, but in fact contains the faint image of his entire body. This theory can be corroborated by the historical depictions of the image of Edessa. Notice it's not a nice vertical portrait or even a square. It's a squatty rectangular portrait. One could easily see how something the size of a burial shroud could be folded a few times lengthwise and arrive at something similar to the geometry seen here. Also of note, in the second photo on the right is the monochromatic image on a sepia background exposed through what looks to be a circular opening in a white slipcover, perfectly in agreement with the description of a wet face on linen that had been mounted to a frame and embellished. So we have more than sufficient evidence to equate the image of Edessa with the Shroud of Constantinople. But this still doesn't trace it all the way back to Jesus. and there isn't a reliable historical source for the image of Edessa prior to the account from 544. So we need to take a different approach if we hope to close the gap. If we look at the artistic depictions of Jesus from the 3rd or the 4th centuries, we observe that Jesus was almost always depicted as Greek in appearance and having fair skin, and almost no beard and short hair. There's almost no consistency from one depiction to the next, and no halo around the head of Jesus. However, in the 6th century, we begin to see the introduction and standardization of a new style of painting Jesus, known as the Christ Pantocrator. This style portrayed Jesus with long hair, parted on the top of the head, a long beard, and a long nose. And we also see the introduction of the halo and a surprising consistency in appearance from one to the next. In at least one of these Pantocrator images, the Holy Face icon, formerly installed in the Lateran Palace in the Vatican, explicitly declares itself to be a copy of the image of Edessa. So we have a good reason to believe that the introduction of the new style and standardization of the facial features are the result of artists copying from the image of Edessa as it became more prolific and public in the 6th century. In fact, since the Shroud of Constantinople would have been viewed through a circular opening in the slipcover while disguised as the image of Edessa, and since the halo did not appear on Jesus before the Pantocrator, it is more than reasonable to conclude that the only reason Christians started applying the halo to Jesus and eventually to the other, quote, saints, was because of the circular frame on the image of Edessa. We can draw further impact of the image of Edessa on Christian artwork through the analysis of the burial and entombment art. Early depictions of the entombment of Jesus showed his body wrapped up like a mummy. In these illuminated Syrian manuscripts, notice the Pantocrator head of Jesus, but the body is simply wrapped up and formless. But that changed around the 11th century, when burial artwork began to show Jesus' body laid out on a long piece of fabric. So we have these two traditions in Christian artwork. Sometime between the 10th and 12th century, Christians stopped using the formless mummy as Jesus' burial and started depicting Jesus laid out on a large piece of fabric. And sometime between the 5th and 7th century, Christians stopped portraying Jesus as an inconsistent and Greek and started adopting the Pantocrator style. And both of these critical points align perfectly with the public life of the image of Edessa and its transition from a facial image to a full-body shroud that God wore. So we have very good reason, based on historical artwork, to believe that Christians were referencing the image of Edessa and eventually the Shroud of Constantinople for their artwork, all the way back to the public appearance of the image of Edessa in the 6th century. So we can use those artistic changes to look for clues about the origins of the image of Edessa. As early as the 4th and 5th centuries, we start to see some of the Pantocrator styles come into being. The halo begins to appear and the long hair and beard come into play. But many of the finer details of the face of Jesus are still not consistent or standardized in these early paintings. However, the first truly standardized instances of the Pantocrator, complete with facial details consistent with the others, are the Christ enthroned mosaic in the new Basilica of St. Apollinaris, completed on site in 526 AD, and the Basilica of St. Apollinaris in Classe, completed on site in 549 AD. Notice mosaics like these take a long time to create, and the Christ enthroned was completed in 526 AD, well ahead of the public appearance of the image of Edessa in 544. But given their consistency with other Pantocrators, and the fact that the mosaics were completed on site, it's more than reasonable to conclude that prior to its more public existence in Edessa, the image of Edessa resided on site with these two mosaics, at least for a time. And interestingly enough, these first two Pantocrator mosaics are located in the same city, Ravenna, Italy. In the 6th century, Ravenna was under the rule of the Ostrogoths. The kingdom was Christian, but they were actually Arian Christians. If you don't know about Arius or his teaching of Arianism, do a little reading on the Council of Nicaea. I won't cover that here for the sake of time. The Byzantines, not friendly to the Arians, overturned the Ostrogoth kingdom in the mid-6th century, so the Arians there would have needed a place of refuge. Edessa was one such city that was friendly to Arianism at the time, so it's well within reason to believe that the Arian Christians had possession of the image and took it with them to Edessa just before the demise of the Ostrogoth kingdom. That puts the image in Ravenna at the right time for the completion of the Pantocrator images on site, and still gets it to Edessa in time for its public debut in 544. But how did the Arians get possession of the image? To answer that, we'll have to go all the way back to 4th century Antioch. The Bible's clear that the apostles, including Paul, Peter, James, and Barnabas, and others, went to Antioch, and that Antioch was a major center for early Christianity in the 1st century. And under the pending Roman destruction of Jerusalem, many Christians at the time fled to Antioch when they left Judea. By the 4th century, the Orthodox Christian sect had built for themselves a massive cathedral, and within its walls they housed many of their relics and treasures. Then in the year 357, Arians took control of the Antioch Cathedral and all of the treasures contained therein. They hid the treasures and fenced them wherever they could to prevent them from falling back into the hands of the Orthodox Christians. In fact, in the year 362, a man named Theodoretus, the treasurer for the Arians in Antioch, died under torture by Emperor Julian because he refused to give up the location of the relics and the treasures. Finally, in 380 AD, Emperor Theodosius reclaimed the Antioch Cathedral and expelled the Arians from the city. Now, since the Arians would have needed a place of refuge, and the Germanic tribes in Ravenna were also Arians and also enemies of Theodosius, it would make perfect sense that they fled to Ravenna and likely took the captured treasures and relics with them. So what exactly do we expect was in the Antioch Cathedral when the Arians took it over? One item of particular interest is described to us in the writings of Athanasius, the Bishop of Alexandria, who lived in the mid-4th century. He tells us of a sacred Christ icon which existed in Syria, where Antioch is, during his lifetime, that it was brought there by the disciples of Jesus in 68 AD, ahead of the Roman destruction of Jerusalem. We can learn a little more about the Christ icon from a 6th century Byzantine monk who describes it as, quote, a very awesome icon bearing the likeness of Jesus. He says that it existed in Antioch and was highly venerated by Christians there. And while we can't say for certain that this Antioch Christ icon is the same as the image of Edessa, it certainly would have been in the right place at the right time, and it certainly carried with it the same level of mystery and veneration as does the image of Edessa. So we definitely cannot rule out the possibility. Alright, now that's a lot of history, so let's do a quick recap of the theory. So the icon starts with the disciples in Jerusalem until it's taken to Antioch in 68 AD. It's kept on site and becomes known as this very awesome icon bearing the image of Christ. In 357 AD, the Arians take control of the Antioch Cathedral and all the relics within, including the Christ icon. Shortly after this date is when we start to see the first Christian paintings that bring in just some of the Pantocrator elements. In 362 AD, the Arian treasurer dies under torture, refusing to give up the relics in the possession of the Arians. Then in 380 AD, the Arians are evicted from Antioch, and they seek shelter in Ravenna with their fellow Arians. Here we see two of the earliest Pantocrator images completed on site, which contain all of the facial details that will eventually become the standard for paintings of Jesus. Sometime in the first half of the 6th century, before the Byzantines conquered the Ostrogoth kingdom in Ravenna, the Arians fled to Edessa, taking the image with them. Then, in 544 AD, we see the first public appearance of what will become the image of Edessa. Within the next 100 years, numerous Pantocrator images appear throughout all of Christendom, all with the halo present and all with the consistent facial features and appearance. The image remains in Edessa until 944, when it's brought to Constantinople. Sometime before 958 AD, someone in Constantinople removed the cover, unmounted it from the board, unfolded the shroud, and discovered it contained the entire body image of Jesus, becoming known as the Shroud that God wore. And within 100 years, the burial artwork of Jesus no longer depicted his body as formless and wrapped like a mummy, but rather laid out on a long piece of fabric. The Shroud of Constantinople was looted in 1204 when the city was sacked, disappearing for a time until it reappeared in Athens in 1205. So all this effectively leaves us with two big questions. First, Is the Christ icon, also known as the image of Edessa, also known as the Shroud of Constantinople, the same thing as the Shroud of Turin? And second, if so, where was it between Constantinople in 1204 and Geoffroy de Charnay in 1350? Let's hit those in order. So why should we think that the Christ icon, image of Edessa, and Shroud of Constantinople are in fact the exact same thing as the Shroud of Turin? First, let's consider the pollen evidence on the Shroud of Turin. Recall there are 58 species of pollen discovered on the shroud. And of those 58 species, there are 3 that do not grow in Europe and do not grow in Jerusalem. Do you remember where those 3 species grow? Urfa, which is ancient Edessa, and Constantinople. In fact, recall there are 55 species of pollen which grow in Jerusalem, 18 species which grow in Edessa, and 13 species which grow in Constantinople. The precise locations of the image of Edessa. So not only is it nearly impossible to explain the remote pollen on the shroud while holding to the medieval forgery hypothesis, it's also nearly impossible to separate the physical pollen evidence on the Shroud of Turin from the historical paper trail on the Shroud of Constantinople. Next, let's consider the historical descriptions of the image of Edessa. It was described as a linen shroud bearing the likeness of Jesus, not made by human hands. The imprint on the linen was said to be the imprint of Jesus washing his face and drying it on a cloth. The emperor's sons could see nothing but a faint face, but Constantine could discern various facial features. The imprint was described as sweat being wiped from Jesus' face, and later the imprint transformed from Jesus' face to be that of his entire body. Now, you can dodge evidence all you want, but there is no denying that the historical descriptions sound absolutely nothing like how one would describe some man-made painting or portrait, and sound exactly like how you would describe the faint image seen on the Shroud of Turin. Further analysis of the physical description reveals that the image of Edessa was a shroud, or Greek word sindon, doubled in 4, mounted to a board, and embellished with a face in the center. So if we take the Shroud of Turin and we fold it in half between the dorsal and ventral images, we're left with just the ventral image. We take that, fold it in half again, and we're left with just the upper torso. Take that, fold it in half again, and we're left with a bust of Jesus centered on a wide, squatty piece of fabric. You take that, put a slipcover on it with a hole in the center, and the result is identical to the mural depiction of the image of Edessa from that church in Turkey. This is further supported by the fact that the Shroud of Turin has fold lines at 1/8 intervals. Now I'll admit that at this point in my investigation, the idea of doubled in 4 kind of threw me for a loop, because the Greek word tetradiplon means 4 doubles, and I had assumed that the doubling was pertaining to folding, like the fabric was folded or doubled over 4 times. But what we just described in converting the Shroud of Turin to the image of Edessa has only 3 folds. And it was only when I cut myself out a little proportional paper model of the shroud that the term became completely clear. When I folded my paper at 1/8 intervals consistent with the fold marks on the shroud, I actually ended up with something that looks like this from the side when it's opened up a little bit. So I've come to the understanding that the term tetradiplon, as meaning the image of Edessa, was folded such that there were 4 sets of double layer fabric. I think this is the most common sense interpretation of the term tetradiplon, and it makes perfect sense when you actually see the layers laid out like this. Anyway, that's not all that critical. Just wanted to bring some clarity on something that might raise some questions. Moving on. We also have a reason to believe that the Shroud of Turin is the Shroud of Constantinople because of the burial artwork changes. This image, which I used earlier to demonstrate the critical point in burial artwork, comes from the Hungarian Prey Codex, which dates to the 12th century or the early 13th at the latest. If we take a closer look at Jesus' hands in the picture, there's something odd about them. He has no thumbs on either hand. Now there are other instances in the image where the thumb is hidden from sight and not drawn, but given the anatomical position of the arms at this position in the drawing, at a minimum, Jesus' left thumb should be clearly visible. However, neither thumb is visible, giving both arms an awkward, non-anatomical position. The artist would have had no reason to draw Jesus in such a manner with such an odd detail unless, of course, he was copying from the Shroud of Turin, in which Jesus' thumbs are flexed out of view and not shown in the image. This would be an amazing feat since the shroud, according to the medieval forgery hypothesis, doesn't exist for anywhere from 70 to 200 years after the Hungarian Prey Codex. Clearly, the most common sense reason for the lack of thumbs and the awkward arm position in the Codex is that the Shroud of Turin was present and served as a model for this artwork, which was completed prior to and very early after the start of the 13th century. Also in the realm of Christian artwork, we can closely analyze the unique facial features that became standard in the Christ Pantocrator images. Things which aren't essential to the main features of Jesus, but nevertheless seem to be important enough to carry them across almost all of these images. For example, there's a dark streak across the forehead, an open-top square between the eyebrows, a V-shaped bridge of the nose, one raised eyebrow, an accentuated nose and one enlarged nostril, an accentuated line between the mustache and the upper lip, an accentuated line between the lower lip and the chin, a gap in the beard leaving a bald spot on the chin, and an odd line across the side of the throat or the neck. And what we find is that all of these features exist in the face of the shroud. In fact, Dr. Alan Wanger developed a method of overlaying images in different light polarizations to find what he calls points of congruence, and published the technique in the journal Optics. This technique has now been widely adopted in the U.S. courts, with anywhere from 45 to 60 points of congruence between two images being sufficient to prove common identity in the U.S. Court of Law. When this technique was applied to a comparison between the Shroud of Turin and the St. Catherine Christ Pantocrator, the technique returned 250 points of congruence. And this is a known 6th century piece of art. Even comparing the Shroud of Turin to a Byzantine Justinian II solidus coin results in 188 points of congruence. And this is a known 7th century coin. To this effect, many skeptics will claim that the Shroud of Turin is simply another Pantocrator, that it was essentially copied from all of these other pieces of art. But that raises the question on a few of the facial features, like the lines in the neck. These lines don't serve any purpose. They don't refer to anything anatomical, and they're even awkwardly forced onto the image in some cases. It makes no sense why these marks would be included, unless, of course, these artists were copying from the Shroud of Turin, which does have this mark, likely due to a defect or a fold around the beard. But perhaps even more interesting is the open-top square between the eyebrows. Again, such a square is not natural and not anatomical. It's awkward and it's forced in these images. The more realistic ones try to soften the edges a little bit, despite still including it as a facial feature. Now, interestingly, the Shroud of Turin does have this feature, but there's more to it than meets the eye. When we look closely, we can see that there's actually a material defect in the shroud right down the middle of the face. A long rectangular strip, slightly darker than the rest of the material. And this extends from the top of the head all the way down through the chin. Therefore, the open top square between the eyebrows is actually attributed to this material defect in the Shroud of Turin, which makes it incredibly difficult to argue that it was copied from the other paintings. Instead, the most common sense interpretation of the evidence is that the material defect led the artists to see a slightly darker square region along the eyebrows and interpret that as a meaningful facial feature. So they included it despite its lack of anatomical correlation and its awkward presence among the facial features. So, based on the pollen evidence and its tight correlation to the historical paper trail of the image of Edessa, the historical descriptions and depictions of the image of Edessa, the unique features of the Christian burial artwork, and hundreds of points of congruence between the Shroud and the Pantocrator images, we can, with a very high degree of confidence, being well within reason, conclude that the image of Edessa is in fact the exact same entity as the Shroud of Turin. Okay, final question. Where did the Shroud of Turin go? Recall it was in Constantinople until 1204 when the city was looted and it disappeared, until it showed up in Athens a year later. So how do we connect these two cities? The answer lies in a man named Othon de la Ruche. He was a French crusader knight who took part in the sacking of Constantinople. After the Crusades, he was appointed Duke of Athens, which would explain how the shroud arrived in Athens. According to a papal bull, Othon retired in 1225 and returned to Burgundy, France with his family. And there, in a castle on his estate, still exists a chest with a plaque on it that says the 13th century coffer in which was preserved at Ré Castle the Shroud of Christ brought by Othon de Ré from Constantinople. From here, Othon had a granddaughter named Isabella de la Ruche, and she married Henri de Vergy. They are the great-great-grandparents of Jeanne de Vergy, the wife of Geoffroy de Charnay. And with that, we've completed the chain of custody from the 1st century Christ icon all the way to the first widely accepted owner of the Shroud of Turin. So based on the historical evidence available to us, we have very good reason to believe that the shroud was taken by Jesus' disciples to Antioch. The Arians carried it to Ravenna and eventually Edessa. The Byzantines brought it to Constantinople. Othon de la Ruche brought it to Athens and France, and then handed it down through his descendants until it reached Geoffroy de Charnay, the first widely accepted owner of the Shroud of Turin. I know this was a lot of information to digest. We covered biology, chemistry, archaeology, history, art, and many other subjects. So just to be certain we have the full case in view, let's do a quick summary of everything we discovered today. A closing argument, if you will. We started with the image formation, where we discovered that the image is not the result of any paint, stain, dye, powder, acid, oil, or any other chemical, nor is it attributed to heat or scorch. Recall that the image is due to a change in the covalent bonds between carbon atoms in the cellulose molecules of the flax fibrils themselves, and the leading scientific theory on how we can induce all of the molecular evidence in the image is radiation. It should be clear to you then that the image formation process and the viable mechanisms that can create it were simply not available to a medieval artist to forge. We can't even recreate all of the molecular phenomena in the shroud with our amazing technology today, so we have absolutely no reason to believe that some medieval artist could do so. However, since we know that a human egg emits energized particles at the moment of fertilization, and a similar particle radiation event from the body while wrapped in the shroud could induce all of the molecular effects we observe in the shroud, the image formation evidence is absolutely consistent with the authenticity of the shroud. Next, we look at the blood stains, where we discovered that the stains are the result of genuine blood. Microscopic analysis indicated the presence of heme derivatives, bilirubin, albumin, creatinine, iron, protein, serum albumin, hemoglobin DNA, both X and Y chromosomes, and the blood returned an antigen profile consistent with the blood type AB. Interestingly, the cross-contamination profile of the blood didn't match any known species of organism, though the closest match was that of human blood. Additionally, since we know that the bilirubin forms as a result of breaking down aged or damaged red blood cells, we can conclude that the source of the blood had many severe wounds. And we also know that creatinine is present in the blood of intense trauma or torture victims. So then, how can we rate the medieval forgery hypothesis in explaining this data? I'm going to cut it some slack here and say maybe. But that comes with some big assumptions. We would have to assume that an artist beat, tortured, and injured some animal with a blood type very close to human AB, but not quite a human in species, and not matching any known species of animal like a dog, horse, pig, cow, etc. We would then need to assume that the artist waited for the blood to start clotting and then applied it to the shroud without so much as a single brush stroke. While those are some huge assumptions with no evidential basis for accepting them as true, it's technically not impossible if a suitable source of the blood could be found. However, unlike the medieval forgery hypothesis, the bloodstain evidence is perfectly consistent with the wounds inflicted upon Jesus during his crucifixion. and given the biblical account of Jesus' conception, it would make perfect sense that his cross-contamination profile would be close to, but not quite entirely in alignment with standard human blood. We then performed a forensic analysis on the content of the shroud and found that the image and bloodstains tell the story of a man who was beaten, flogged, died upright with his arms outstretched, bore puncture wounds consistent with the practice of Roman crucifixion, bore puncture wounds on his scalp, and issued a post-mortem flow of blood and another fluid from his right side. Additionally, the image displays advanced physiological foreknowledge in that the puncture points are at the wrist, unlike every piece of medieval artwork which places them in the palms, an insufficient location for supporting the body weight during crucifixion. And it also portrays the thumbs as flexed out of view, consistent with nerve damage from the puncture at the wrist. I would have to say that the medieval forgery hypothesis could potentially explain the forensic details. A good artist could create an anatomically correct image of a man and take into account most of the features on the shroud. However, there's a big assumption around the wrist puncture location in that the artist just happened to break step with every medieval artist on the puncture location and just happened to choose a location more suitable for the job. Plus, the artist would need to have advanced knowledge of the nervous system to anticipate that the thumbs would have been flexed out of view. Technically not impossible, but those are some big assumptions for which we have no evidential basis. But as with the other data, the forensic analysis is perfectly consistent with the authenticity of the shroud. We also looked at the evidence for the sudarium and its correlation to the Shroud of Turin. We discovered that the two fabrics contain the exact same blood type, an identical facial geometry, and matching blood origin points. They contain many non-European species of pollen and even contain a significant amount of pollen from a thorn-bearing Middle Eastern thistle known as Gundelia. And they both contain stains and content consistent with a death by crucifixion. So how do our hypotheses fare in explaining the evidence? The medieval forgery is simply not consistent with the tight correlation between these two fabrics. By the time of their carbon dates, both fabrics were in their present European countries, which leaves no time for the fabrics to reside in the Middle East or Africa to pick up the numerous species of pollen there. Likewise, the likelihood that two artists separated by hundreds of years and hundreds of miles could paint two different fabrics to have matching blood origin points and matching blood types, especially when the flow pattern is different between the two, for all intents and purposes, is non-existent. So I see no way to rectify the tight correlation of these two fabrics with the medieval forgery hypothesis. The evidence is much more indicative of the authenticity of both fabrics. Next, we performed a physical analysis on the shroud. We discovered that the shroud is made from hand-spun thread, not at all consistent with a European textiles industry that used the spinning wheel as a standard piece of equipment, but perfectly consistent with the first-century textile manufacturing processes. We discovered that the thread is sewn into a 3-to-1 herringbone weave, a pattern not being produced in medieval Europe, but prolific in first-century Syria. We translated the physical dimensions into marketplace units for medieval Europe and ancient Syria, and the shroud is a fractional unit of measure of medieval Europe, but exactly in line with standard units of measure for ancient Syria. We took a closer look at the stitch that attaches the side strip to the main shroud, and found its only match comes from Jewish textiles from a city destroyed in the 1st century AD and never reoccupied. Not at all compatible with medieval European sewing practices, but definitely consistent with 1st century Jewish practices. We discovered the existence of cotton fibers within the linen threads, a cotton which does not grow in Europe, but is native to the Middle East. We found limestone particles on the shroud, which do not match samples gathered in Europe, but are consistent with samples taken from Jerusalem. We uncovered a significant amount of pollen from Jerusalem, Edessa, and Constantinople, which cannot be explained if the fabric originated in medieval Europe and has resided there ever since, but is perfectly consistent with an origin in the Middle East and journey through Edessa and Constantinople on its way to Europe. We also reviewed 3 tests which can aid in determining the age of flax fibers, all of which directly conflict with the medieval origin date, yet align perfectly with the 1st century date of origin. And we found the environmental damage from ambient sources is consistent with that seen on the Dead Sea Scrolls, which date to no later than 70 AD. Again, in conflict with a medieval origin, but perfectly consistent with an origin in the 1st century. So where does this leave us? The physical evidence on and within the shroud is simply not compatible with the medieval origin hypothesis, but it's all perfectly consistent with the authenticity hypothesis. We spent a significant amount of time looking into the historical analysis of the shroud. We reviewed the historical descriptions of the image of Edessa and saw that they are not at all consistent with a man-made painting, but are perfectly consistent with the image on the Shroud of Turin. We realized that the physical description of the image of Edessa is perfectly consistent with a shroud folded up and mounted to a board, and discovered that the Shroud of Turin actually has folds at 1/8 intervals. We identified numerous facial features that became standard and consistent across all the Pantocrator images, and highlighted that those unique facial features are actually present in the shroud image itself. And since some of the facial features are due to material defects in the shroud, we came to the conclusion that the shroud was the model for the other artwork, and not the other way around. We referenced Dr. Wanger's polarization light technique for comparing two images, which when used to prove common identity in the U.S. Court of Law requires only 45 to 60 points of congruence, yet results in over 250 points of congruence between the Shroud of Turin and the 6th century St. Catherine's Christ Pantocrator image. We reviewed the Hungarian Prayer Codex, which not only portrays Jesus as laid out on a long piece of fabric for burial, but also contorts Jesus' arms into an awkward position to hide the thumbs from view, consistent with the image seen on the shroud, despite the fact that the Hungarian Prayer Codex dates to anywhere from 70 to 200 years before the accepted date of the shroud. We highlighted that the change in the standardization in Jesus' facial features and artistic style corresponds perfectly with the time at which the image of Edessa was removed from the Antioch Cathedral and became more publicly available. We further highlighted that the change in burial artwork from a formless mummified Jesus to a naked Jesus laid out on a long burial shroud occurred at the same time as the Byzantines discovered the true nature of the image of Edessa. And in the end, we established a well-defined historical paper trail for the shroud, being carried with the disciples of Jesus to Antioch in 68 AD, where it was revered by Christians as the awesome icon bearing the likeness of Christ. It was captured by the Arians when they took control of the Antioch Cathedral and the Christian relics within. They later took it to Ravenna, and eventually to Edessa, as Arianism was overthrown by the Orthodox emperors. The Byzantines made a deal with the Muslim rulers in Edessa to exchange it for a military ceasefire, the release of 200 prisoners, and 12,000 pieces of silver, bringing it to Constantinople amid fanfare and celebration. Soon after, the Byzantines discovered the true nature of the image of Edessa, and it henceforth became known as the Shroud that God wore, and was on display for all to see, while the image of Edessa simply disappeared from the historical record. It was in Constantinople until 1204 when the city was sacked by the Fourth Crusade, and a French crusader named Othon de la Roche took the shroud. He carried it with him to Athens and then eventually to Burgundy, France, where it was handed down through his family to Geoffrey de Charnay, the first widely accepted owner of the shroud. So then where does all this historical evidence leave our two hypotheses? The medieval forgery hypothesis simply cannot make sense of the historical data. There's too much correlation between the Shroud of Turin and the historical account of the Christ icon, the image of Edessa, and the Shroud of Constantinople. We have absolutely no reason to believe that these historical icons were anything different than the Shroud of Turin. But of course, as evidenced by the historical data, the authenticity of the shroud is nearly impossible to deny. But despite every bit of scientific and historical evidence pointing to the authenticity of the shroud, many people continue to reject it based on the medieval carbon date. So I did a deep dive into the carbon dating result to see what's actually there. We observed that when combined, the uncertainty of all the samples across the 3 labs was well outside the 2 sigma acceptable limit, meaning there was likely some bias unaccounted for in the data. But when plotted against the distance from the edge of the shroud, we discovered there's actually a positive correlation between the calculated age and the distance from the edge. We also reviewed the very tight correlation between the Sudarium of Oviedo and the Shroud of Turin, despite the fact that they carbon date to 600 years apart. These three facts gave us significant cause to question the veracity of the carbon dating results, but we needed a hypothesis that could explain all of the phenomena we find in the data. We found it in Robert Rucker's neutron absorption hypothesis. We heard about the theory of particle radiation emitting from the body in the shroud, energized neutrons which reacted with the nitrogen atoms in the shroud to produce new carbon-14 atoms, just as it's produced in the atmosphere. And we found that using just a minuscule fraction of the available neutrons in the human body, we could create enough carbon-14 atoms to make a first-century shroud look like it originated in the 14th century. Additionally, Rucker's hypothesis actually predicted both the absolute value of a 14th century date and the correlation between calculated age and the distance from the edge of the shroud, as is seen in the actual lab data. His model even further predicted the date of the Sudarium if it had been placed in a certain area on the bench adjacent to the body. And since his hypothesis is consistent with the leading scientific theory on the mechanism for the image formation in the shroud, and we know that human embryos emit particle radiation at the moment they're fertilized, we have absolutely no reason to reject his hypothesis. He has presented a way to know for certain if this theory is true by carbon testing a piece of the shroud from the center of the mass, which would date to thousands of years in the future. All we can hope is that the Vatican will let us do that in the near future. But for now, the theory aligns with all of the other scientific evidence. It predicts the calculated dates of both fabrics and predicts the age-distance correlation seen on the shroud. So we can consider it a very sound theory. So then how do our hypotheses fare? I'll give the medieval forgery theory some leeway here and say that it might be able to explain the carbon dating. After all, carbon dating is the single piece of evidence on which the vast majority of skeptics stand when holding to their hypothesis. However, after a complete investigation of the actual lab data, we must assume that the very wide or wider than typically accepted uncertainty was simply the result of some error or bias in the fabric. We must assume that the age-distance correlation is actually just random noise, and we must assume that the otherwise very tight correlation between the shroud and the Sudarium is simply the result of luck or a freak coincidence. These are some pretty big assumptions with no evidentiary basis. But if someone is willing to accept them on blind faith, then carbon dating could potentially support the medieval forgery hypothesis. Alternatively, under Rucker's hypothesis, the entirety of the carbon dating evidence fits perfectly with the rest of the historical and the scientific evidence, which clearly points to the authenticity of the shroud. So then what can we say as our final conclusion? What's the best explanation of the cumulative case of the evidence discovered from biology, chemistry, history, and art? At best, the medieval forgery hypothesis could possibly explain some of the evidence discovered, but taken in its entirety, the case for the medieval forgery simply does not hold water. However, every piece of evidence makes perfect sense if the Shroud of Turin is in fact the authentic burial cloth of Jesus. So for me, I chose to follow the evidence where it leads, and I wholeheartedly invite you to do the same.